2013-14 Provost Forums on Public Education and the Social Good. During our first two seasons, we've organized forums around the work and views of individuals representing a range of academic disciplines and professions, segments of industry and government agencies. What we haven't done yet is devote a forum to the views of one of the most important stakeholder groups in the public university, the student themselves. So truly, this is a very, very different forum today. As every teacher knows, there's much of value to be learned from listening to students, so not to avail ourselves of their perspective would be unwise on any account. To this, I'll add that if we want to foster a true community of our campus, and we do, we must actively seek out opportunities to get a clearer picture of what our students are thinking, even when we suspect it may cause us to feel uncomfortable now and then. Today, we're going to take advantage of one such opportunity and hopefully pave the way for even greater student involvement in this lecture series by featuring a presentation of 6 UC Davis honors students who've just completed the Davis Honors Challenge, a part of the University Honors Program. Andrea Zhao, Jack Killian, Michael Rogers, Susan Rowe, Megan Saba, and Jack Taylor will present the views of UC Davis students on the topic, the public university and the social good. These views have been gleaned, as you'll learn, from an online survey, from interviews, and a focus group conducted just this quarter. Immediately after my introductory remarks, the student's professor in the DHC program, Dr. Nesrin Sargul-Klein, professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering and director of the Space Engineering Research and Graduate Program, will give our presenters a proper introduction. In the interest of full disclosure, here I will confess to acting as the client for this honors project, in the hopes that it would enrich this lecture series. During winter and spring quarters, I met with the students regularly to discuss readings and ideas relevant to their topic. I suggested a range of issues on which it would be valuable to hear student views and collaborate a bit on the logistics. Concurrently, Dr. Sargul-Klein and the DHC staff have done much of the heavy lifting on teaching, mentoring, advising, and making all sorts of arrangements to help bring this project to a successful conclusion. Though this was a village effort in some respects, I want to stress that the project was designed and carried out by the students, and their analysis of the data they gathered is entirely their own. I'm aware of only some of their findings and conclusions, so I too am looking forward to getting the full picture today. I will share with you, however, one thing that I've already taken from this experience. I've discovered how deeply interested and engaged our students can be in the question of what the public university can and should be in the 21st century, especially when they've been given sufficient opportunity and resources to explore that topic. I believe that the students working on this project benefited in a number of ways. Speaking personally, I'll say that it was a privilege for me to participate in a focused conversation with these exceptional young scholars over the past 2 quarters. Besides our DHC representatives, we're also privileged that the following 2 distinguished individuals from UC Davis have agreed to participate today as discussants and panelists. Adela de la Torre, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Professor in the Department of Chicano Studies, and Director of the Center for Transnational Health, and Ann Huff Stevens, Professor and Chair of the Department of Economics and Director of the Center for Poverty Research. Many of you will remember that Professor Stevens from an excellent forum held this past January, in which she presented the findings of the UC Davis study group on accessibility and affordability, which she chaired. Before I leave the subject of our program, let me remind you that you're all invited to continue the discussion during the reception right outside this room, immediately following our audience question period. Now, to quell any fears that I might have provoked when I said this was the final Provost Forum, rest assured that this is only the final forum of this year's series. This ongoing lecture series will resume next year with about 8 new events that I'm confident you'll find, as the ancient Roman poet Horace might say, both enjoyable and useful. Information on next year's forums will be posted on my website sometime this summer, and throughout next academic year, there will be notices for specific events coming by land, sea, and air. So I urge you to keep your eyes posted. As always, videos of all past forums, and this one will be no exception, are available on my website. So I want to personally thank the Provost Forum's organizing committee for creating such a successful second season for this series, the two campus entities that have joined my office to co-sponsor this event, the UC Davis Honors Challenge and the Community and Regional Development Program, Dr. Sarah Klein for joining us today to introduce the DHC program and the presenters, our panelists, of course, Vice Chancellor Delatorre and Professor Stevens, and of course our presenters, but I think I want to mention two other people who've helped. They get credited a bit by the presenters, but I really want to thank Jillian Brown, I'm sorry, is that right? Jillian Butler of the Office of Institutional Analysis, who I knew afforded us great help, and Craig Buchwald, who really helped me work with the students throughout these past 2 quarters. So let me now yield the podium to Dr. Sarah Klein.
Thank you, Provost Hexter, for this. I'm an engineer by training, but my students in the class were from all different diverse disciplines. Bridging the different disciplines, what we have done, we have spent about 6 months' time, that's a half a year time together, first learning about different research techniques, then learning about how to communicate ideas freely and research techniques, later dealing with risk analysis and also dealing with difficult people. And during the second term, what they have done, they have worked with their sponsors to do the project. Today, I am very proud to introduce this particular project that was sponsored by our provost. That is the project of university, a public university. Our students titled this project to be Our Students, Our Voices. Very proper, you shall agree with me. As you all know, that UC system initially was established to establish campuses so that we get exceptional and easily accessible education for students in California. However, we all also have experienced budget cuts, this and that. That is a bit difficult to maintain that. You will all agree with me on that. We're trying our best. And what is unique about this particular project that students took on is the fact that this is the very first time student opinions are taken into account. With that, I'd like to welcome our students to you, but before, please hold your applause. I'd like to introduce them, call them onto the podium one at a time. Once they are all introduced, we'll of course extend our warmest welcome to them. Susan, you may want to join me here. Susan Rowe, she's a psychology major. She intends to spend her career dealing with standardized tests for K through 12 education. Next, we have Andrea Zhao. She is a political science major, and she would like learning a lot, so she's spending her time learning a lot in college, and she has to make up her mind what she wants to pursue as a career. Next, we have Jack Killian. His major is in international relations, and he wants to become a medical doctor one day. And following that, we have Michael Rogers. His major is in food science, and he likes to improve his activities once he graduates in food science. And final candidate, we have Jack Tyler. He is he's a biochemistry major. He's also a musician, by the way. He's an accomplished musician. He likes to continue his education into MD, PhD program. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming. We'd like Andrea to introduce our project objectives.
So the main goal of our project is to collect student opinions and visions on a variety of aspects on the public university, such as UC Davis. And for the past 2 quarters, we have passed out survey, we have conducted interviews as well as focus group in order to collect these data. And we have finalized and analyzed these results and presenting to you today.
So before we got started with our project, we wanted to make sure that we were structuring our project correctly. And so we went through a pretty extensive literature review. And we began by looking at some of the older models of what a university and a public university can be. And what this did is gave us an idea that indeed the university can have a purpose. And so what we did is we looked at some of the historical legislation that developed what the University of California system is. The Morrill Act granted many states, most states, all states I think, some land in which to place a university system on. And then in California, the 3-tier system of the master plan was created, where a California community college was available for anybody who wanted some higher education, with some higher qualifications. You could come into the California State University system. And then finally, at the top of the tier, there was the University of California system. And one of the biggest emphasis for the University of California system was research.
All the literature we collected gave us a good background on the foundation of what the public university was supposed to be according to philosophers, academics, and legislators. But the point of views of the students, in this case undergraduates of the public university, remain largely unknown. For our project, we sought to collect and establish student opinion on the public university. We collected our data 3 different ways. We emailed 3,200 UC Davis undergraduates a survey so we could obtain a quantitative measure of student opinions towards the public university. We also asked our survey participants to participate in either a one-on-one interview or a focus group. The purpose of our interviews and focus group were to collect qualitative data on the range of student opinions towards the public university. We created our survey using an online survey tool provided to us by Jillian Butler of the UC Davis Office of Institutional Analysis. This survey tool allowed us to create a survey that UC Davis undergraduates could log into with their Kerberos ID, which we'll use later to pull demographic information about our respondents. This benefited both us and them because it meant the respondents could answer less questions on the survey since, they didn't have to provide their demographic information. Our survey consisted of mainly yes or no and how much do you agree or disagree with this statement questions, although we also asked respondents to provide maximum limits for out-of-state student enrollment and class size. There are about 40 questions total. We conducted our analysis with SPSS and we looked for the frequency of and correlations between student opinions. Additionally, we compiled all the graphs and histograms that you'll see in our presentation with Excel.
So in order to gather some qualitative data to supplement our survey, we conducted interviews with 10 UC Davis undergrads. These interviews were about 20 to 30 minutes long each and consisted of 12 questions that covered both their general ideas of what a public university should be, for instance, what would be the goals of the ideal public university, as well as their personal experience attending one, for instance, why did you choose to attend a public university? They followed a semi-structured format, so although the same 12 questions were asked to all students, different follow-ups were asked, which allowed them to elaborate on or clarify a point they made, just so that the conversation could flow more organically. Later, the interview data was analyzed by looking at notes that we'd made, as well as listening to the recordings of the interviews, so that we could note key words, phrases, ideas that popped up a lot to get kind of a sense of the broad consensus of students, as well as noting some interesting anecdotes that were brought to our attention.
We also conducted a focus group, and the focus group was really another chance for us to collect qualitative data, and we really wanted to come to the idea of how do students approach this topic of the public university, and what are their thoughts on the current state of the university in relation to that. So we knew we had to set up the ideal public university and understand what our students thought this should be. So we had basically that question introducing the focus group. We also gave several questions, 5 questions, such as who is the public, very broad questions, what distinguishes the public university from other kinds of learning, how should the public benefit from the university, and as you can see from these questions, you could really answer them many ways as to how the public is oriented and spoken to in the university. So after that, we also gave an opportunity to share several perspectives, historical perspectives, about the ideal university from the philosophers we studied in the literature review, and then gave them real information about the current status of UC Davis specifically and the larger public university system in America, and finally came back to the question of what do you think? And the whole focus group was very much discussion oriented, was videotaped and audio recorded, and we then analyzed the results, and we were able to put some faces and names to a few opinions that came up in our survey and in our interview, and how they relate to one another, those opinions. So.
We had 270 respondents to our survey, which was sent out to about 3,200 UC Davis undergraduates. We found our sample to be fairly representative of the UC Davis undergraduate population, except of course, we found that females were a little bit more present in our sample of UC Davis undergraduates than you would typically find in the UC Davis population.
So we'd like to share what some of the respondents reported was an idea of what their ideal public university is. So near the end of our survey, we offered a free response box for these comments. And here are some of the things that we saw the most frequently. And keep in mind that as we go through these, some of these aspects are currently a part of the UC Davis system, and some of them may be beneficial if we were to incorporate them. So aesthetics on the university campus were described as being free and open with a positive atmosphere and accommodating facilities, and the community to populate such a campus should be diverse in many regards, including economic status, ethnicity, culture, class standing, physical abilities, and even sexual orientation. Participants reported that ideally, the public university should receive more or even most of its funding from the state or country in which it resides. And in addition, the university should be comfortably affordable for any qualified student. And the university should have a social impact. This could be through educating individuals who will go out and contribute meaningfully to society, or even providing goods that would benefit society. In regards to the faculty, the students widely reported a preference to professors who care about the success and accomplishments of the students. And in addition, professors were hoped to be excellent educators and researchers. So research at the ideal university should be often exciting and beneficial to the university and society. Students should be able to meaningfully participate and contribute to such research. In regards to classes, these classes should be widely available for students to incorporate into their busy schedules. And the content, in courses where the content is fairly consistent and not often changing, perhaps the text could be free or covered in the cost of the courses. Finally, an ideal university should have copious resources for students, including tutoring, research, internships, activities, job opportunities on and off campus, and career preparation, and also health and wellness centers. And all of these different resources should be well accessible and well structured.
So when asked about the goals of the ideal public university, most students first and foremost mentioned education of undergraduates. Yet research is also a really important part of what defines the UC system. It was explicitly designated in the master plan as the primary research branch of the California system of public higher education. And indeed, we found that many students had performed research already while attending UC Davis. 37.2% of those who responded to the survey reported that they had. Additionally, of those students who had not performed research already, 73.8% said that they had plans to in the future. So clearly, students were pretty positive about research on campus. It's important to note that there's differing views of what constitutes research. So we left it up to each participant to decide what defined research. For some, it was very narrow. For instance, research in a laboratory or field work. For others, it could be different forms of scholarship or creative endeavors, such as design projects. So clearly, there's many different ways that research is done on campus. And students were generally very positive about it. They said that there's this great atmosphere of, their professors and fellow students conducting research. There's really great opportunities to themselves. And one student noted that seeing research conducted around him had given him a deeper appreciation of how scientific discoveries are actually made. Again, though, students did care a lot about their education. So we are curious what they thought that the priority of faculty should be, education or research. When asked in a forced choice question on the survey whether the primary priority of faculty should be instruction or research, 72.4% reported that it should be instruction, while just 12.6% said research. It's important to note, though, that quite a few students, 36 in total, chose the other box, and of those, 28 responded that research and instruction should really be equal priorities of faculty. So it's important to not think of research and instruction as an either-or relationship. They actually really complement each other and go hand in hand. And there were differing views, though, on how research had either added or subtracted to students' education here. One said that she felt like she was neglected by some of her professors because they were so wrapped up in their own research, whereas another said that seeing how engaged and passionate about the research their professors were had inspired him to pursue a PhD of his own.
In this question on the survey, we asked students if they felt that there should be a limit on the number of out-of-state students or international students that were going to attend the University of Davis. And 51% of the respondents said that they do not feel there should be a limit on either national out-of-state or international students, which is actually what the current system is for Davis. However, 24.2% of respondents said that there should be an enrollment on the out-of-state American students, and this average limit that they proposed was around 22.3%. 33% of respondents said that there should be an enrollment limit on international students, and the average limit for that was 12.9%. So we were wondering why some students would propose that there should be a limit, and we didn't actually ask on that. So if we were to make a guess, what some of the reports that we found in the focus groups or the interviews were that there was some perceived competition, perhaps some funding impacts for the other students, and issues of accessibility, especially for residents of California. There was a correlation between students who said that there should be an out-of-state limit. They were also more likely to say that there should be a limit for international students. And generally, the trend that we see is that the limit for out-of-state students on the x-axis here is roughly twice as high as what the limit for international students they proposed. And this is interesting. If we looked at the incoming class for the fall of 2014, 10% of the freshmen will be out-of-state, whereas 17.4% will be international, which is the opposite of what students had suggested possibly they might like to see.
Another topic we'd like to feature is how students feel about class sizes and how they feel it impacts their education. So regarding lecture, we find that the most common response for the maximum lecture size is around 100 students. Of course, it varied enormously between students, and so the mean is more around 200 students, 177. But this does indicate that people prefer a lecture capacity that is smaller than the maximum capacity of most of the lecture halls, at least lower division students experience in their time at UC Davis. Speaking about discussion sizes, which generally have a smaller connotation, the preferred maximum was much lower, 24, So that really indicates preference towards smaller discussions because people were often referencing 30 as adequate discussion size in the focus group. So 24 is below that, and as a maximum, it's quite telling. We also brought this up in our focus group and wanted to get a more equal, egalitarian view of this and where students were coming from with these perspectives. So we had a good sample of transfer and non-transfer students, so an experience of the community college system and the UC system for all 4 years. And everyone agreed smaller classes are preferable. Many people even said that community college does it a lot better when it comes to having one-on-one instruction in a smaller classroom environment, yet still many people agreed it's not quite practical to have that type of instruction at the UC where there are other priorities. An interesting perspective that we had was one of the students feeling that smaller classes and one-on-one instruction was something he wanted in his upper division education especially. And to have that, he would much rather sacrifice having an enormous lecture size in his lower division education in order to have a smaller classroom experience later on. Because he felt the difference between 200 people in a lecture hall and 500 is quite negligible with one instructor, whereas the jump up from 30 students to 90 is a quite different learning experience. So we came to the idea of forum-style classrooms. Everyone agreed very much unanimously in a sample of around 8 people that that's beneficial. And we discussed the idea of office hours. Is that a good alternative? Do you have an option to have one-on-one instruction in a lecture hall? There's a lot of different views on this. Some people had good experiences, but it was very split half and half, saying that lecture hall office hours can be as packed, if not more packed, than a discussion setting because so many students go in for help and then you're just kind of speaking to your friends.
In terms of technology and online classes at a university, as you can see for the survey results, about 10% of the respondents said that online courses are more appealing than in-class courses. About 30 of them were neutral, but from the focus group, the people said that it really depends on the classes. But it also shows that the majority of the students still value in-class courses more than online courses. Okay. So right here on the left side, it's a graph that shows a correlation between online course appeal and the importance of face-to-face interactions. As you can see, this means that generally, if a student believes face-to-face interactions with professors is more important, they're less likely to say that online courses are appealing. And on the right, it shows an interesting split between the students who think that online components are an adequate measure of understanding versus those that don't. And in a focus group, we found that most of the students are leaning toward that online components are not adequate measures. Yet at the same time, they found the online components to be useful for learning. It's the same with interviewees where they believe in-class or physical teaching is better simply because they think the actual classes are more challenging, they're more effective in terms of learning, and they're better supported. One student brought up the analogy where he said there's a difference between learning a skill such as coding with Python versus actually getting a degree in computer science in a physical college.
When undergraduates were asked how much they agreed with the statement, public universities are currently in a state of crisis, 58.3% of undergraduates agreed, whereas 5% disagreed and 36.7% felt neutral. In the interviews, we found that many of our respondents thought that the word crisis was heavily loaded. So perhaps when we asked this question in our survey, we could have said, how much do you agree with this statement? Public universities have a lot of problems. And we predict that perhaps we would have had many more people agree with this statement than they did with the public university is in crisis. So long story short, undergraduates do think that there are some things in the public university that need to be fixed. We correlated respondents' answers to this statement with others, and we found that respondents that think public universities are in crisis are also more likely to value the right to protest, think taxes should increase to fund education, think private funding taints higher education, and think public universities should produce public goods.
Lastly, I would like to talk to you about some of the additional insights we have from the interviews or not necessarily directly addressed in our survey. Well, first of all, when students were asked about who should benefit from public universities or what are the goals of public university, almost all said that it is to serve and educate the public, the citizens of the state. And of the public is a key phrase in their answers, even though that international students or out-of-state students are not always referenced in the discussion. But one student did state that in terms of research, the benefits from university should go beyond the state and benefit the society as general. And he also said that the size of the UC system in itself implies that it can service more people that's not just in the state, but also out of the state. Secondly, when asked about specifically about private funding and funding for the university, almost all of the students responded with a range of acceptance. Some were strongly for accepting private funding, believing that resources and capitals from corporations can really benefit the education. Most of the students were more ambiguous because they did state some concerns with limited intellectual freedom that comes with corporate funding. One student did bring up the issue of funding by recruiting international students. As we said earlier, a lot of students believe that there should be more national students and international students. And one of the reasons that she referenced was she viewed it as a way of making profit for the university, and she believes that that is going away from the purpose of a public university. And lastly, I would like to talk about some of the challenges that are brought up by the students. In general, students reference the availability and accessibility of resources and opportunities on campus as the major challenge. But one did speak of the necessity for a better GE system because she said that right now on our campus, a lot of the GE system are not as inclusive to non-STEM students. For example, as an arts major, as a social science major, if you would like to explore science or engineering classes, they're not as many or adequate GEs that actually help you in explore these interests. Another respondent stated that the current university system makes it hard for peer learning. And she quoted Mark Twain saying that, "I have never let my schooling interfere with my education." This expresses her attitude toward the system. And several others did resonate with this view and also believe that university degrees are more like high school diplomas back in the days. Simply because university degrees is becoming the minimum for the job market, but conversely, students still feel that this education should prepare them for their career. The final challenge that we thought was unique and interesting was one student brought up the issue about residency requirement. And one thing that was difficult was that she was considered a resident at California by the government and also by the CSU because she is physically living in California. She's financially independent, but she's not recognized for financial aid for the UC system simply because her parents are out of state. And this is sad simply because she has been on the dean's list for the entire year that she was at UC Davis, and she really does love the school, but she could not come back for the education because she didn't have the funding.
In regards to our focus group, we'd like to take some time to establish what unique characteristics our focus group attributed to a four-year university education, especially at UC Davis. So we spoke about what is different about the education here on campus, and everyone did prefer, transfer and non-transfer alike, the four-year ideal university experience at UC Davis over any other Cal State or community college type of education. Yet, we still found that many people, at least half, felt that the lower division education in the community college system was comparable, if not superior at times, to the education they experienced on campus at UC Davis for a variety of reasons, whether it be lab sort of experiences. We would like to explore that more to see how that relates to everything. And also research the unique characteristics of the UC didn't seem to factor into that lower division educational concern as well. So what is unique about the UC experience that you can get in 4 years? And it boiled down to essentially a diverse student community that's more reflective of real world environments and career life, as well as the opportunity to network for all 4 years. And I would also suggest that the idea of free play of ideas is something that seems attractive to this group of individuals. I'd like to mention some limitations of our survey before we break down into the panel. Our survey basically was sent out to many people through an electronic listserv system, and we had lots of survey fatigue and lots of competing surveys that address similar topics. So if we had more time and a special time to release our survey, we would like to do that. Interviews and focus groups the people were collected for those through our electronic survey. At the end of it, you could join the interview or the focus group, and it seemed that not a lot of people actually took advantage of that opportunity, so we resorted to peer recruitment techniques, more direct, asking people to come to our group. So we'd have more physical advertising for those groups in the future if we were to do it again. One last thing I'd like to mention is we'd like to acknowledge that we were collecting the opinions of undergraduate students, and the motivations of students were very education-centric. So when factoring in their ideals for what a public university system should be, there was quite a feeling that perhaps research and other emphasis of the university might be a little neglected by the student experience and opinion, as opposed to other members of the university community.
So in conclusion, we'd like to leave you with a few thoughts. We quickly realized through the analysis of our data that every student is different in that no two students necessarily had the same picture of what the ideal university would be. But even with this, we did find that there are some very clear trends and issues that students either completely agree on or are very split on, and this is what we've presented today. We see some evidence that this information that we found is valuable, both by the various projects, both on and off campus, that are seeking similar objectives of collecting student opinions. And we feel that this information will be important as we make changes to the university for the future. And with that, I'd like to make some quick acknowledgments to our client, Provost Ralph Hexter, Craig Buchwald, Professor Nesrin Serigal-Klein, our TA, Garrett DeHond, and DHC Administrator Lolita Nelson-Adkins, and many others. Thank you very much for coming, and we will get to some Q&A.
Getting to the pretty.
So glad you could join us. Yeah. So thank goodness our sixth student, Megan Saba, has been able to come for this part. So I'm delighted that we have, as I said before, two distinguished visitors, Professor Stevens and Vice Chancellor De La Torre. And what we've asked them to do is to offer some of their own comments on what they've heard, and then to ask some questions of the panelists. I don't think this will turn into a public, dissertation defense or anything, but who knows? But after, my vision is that after the panelists have exhausted their own dialogue, I'll ask Professor Stevens and Vice Chancellor De Torre to open it up to the questions and moderate what will, I'm sure, be an engaging conversation. So I don't think we determined an order, but Adela, do you want to begin?
First of all, I want to thank the students for an exceptional project. It's not not easy to do both survey work using quantitative methods as well as qualitative work using focus groups and in-depth interviews. So that is quite an accomplishment, and in particular, I'm fully aware of the issues of survey fatigue because we were doing our UQs, which is a large survey that we are working on and getting student data right now. But I actually had more questions than comments because I felt the other thing that I observed was the extensive reading list that was provided as a background for this particular project, which, I'm assuming informed your methodology. And so what I wanted to ask you as I was listening to the results, which is kind of the end after doing the literature review and the discussion, what in the literature, because you really do have this wealth of information starting from the Victorian age forward to some of the work of Clark Kerr and many of the speakers, what in the literature prompted the kind of questions that you've put in your survey and this particular project? Were there any particular pieces that you felt compelled you to move forward in the direction that you were going?
Is that working? Oh, I gotta hold it, okay. So I would like to say that I think the most interesting part about the literature is that it starts with Newman, Cardinal John Henry Newman, his thinkings of the university. He begins around the 1830s, and the Morrill Act comes into effect in the 1860s. And so it seemed to me, in the English-speaking world at least, there seems to be a change in the idea of what a university should be. And the Morrill Act specifies that not only are we studying the classical humanities, as Provost Hexer has had an extensive knowledge in, but we are also focusing on exploitable knowledge as far as research, scientific research, many prongs related to agricultural innovation and things of that nature. And so that was very interesting to me, but it also reflects some differing opinions about the university and the goals of the university. Newman specifies the university comes from two words, unity and diversity, finding a unified truth in a diversity of different fields and disciplines, and the university's role is as a mediator between unique exchange between faculty and thinkers and students to arrive at a fuller truth that informs all of society, and it's kind of separate from society. It's like another entity unto itself that has the freedom to explore that. But as we progress through the research, we found Clark Kerr's thinking of the multiversity. There's a lot of preset goals and ideals in society that we're trying to forward with the institution of the university. And so that relationship and interplay between the society and the university as a knowledge-generating machine and as an instructional or educational entity seem to be very different in the different literature perspectives we referenced. So we were interested in comparing student opinions and perceptions and seeing where they would kind of put their perspective on that spectrum and which literature they might have the closest relationship to. I think in our findings we found a very obvious societal sort of approach to the problem because we kind of felt like we were reconstructing the master plan goals when we were having our findings, and so that's what I think.
So just on that note, I was going to start with a question that's really sort of a natural follow-up, which is I was struck at the earlier forum event I participated in, as well as today, at how much undergraduate students are aware of and think about the master plan. And I guess my question is, both based on the survey responses and the interviews and your own synthesis of this project, do you think that the master plan has sort of stood the test of time? How should it be modified, if at all? What are your thoughts on that today?
Well, I might have something to say. It seems that funding perhaps was one of the biggest issues that was a bit contrasting in the master plan. I don't believe the master plan ever specifically said how much funding the state meant to provide, forever. But the amount of funding that the universities receive right now is fairly low. especially in comparison to what it has been historically, and students found that this was a bit distressing. Private funding has been a topic that we discussed with the students, and it seems like many students are open to the idea. But sometimes these projects that are funded by private corporations or private funding in general, they can have a more goal-oriented end to it, whereas sometimes research may not necessarily know what it's trying to find. And so those research projects that can often have some exciting discoveries that were not intended at the beginning of the project might not get a chance to be funded through private funding. So students recognize this, and they believe that we should be careful with where we find our funding, and that it might even be beneficial if the state could come back and provide more funding in the future.
Thanks. I'd just like to add that when we take out public funding from the government, the master plan was created with the public good in mind, and when you take the public interest out and insert a private interest, to go off of what Jack said, there is a conflict of interest for the public, and I think it is a real concern that we need to think about and have an open discourse about, not just in the university, but in government as well. I mean, if we probably do need to look at public-private partnerships as an option, and I think that they are an excellent way of funding for the university, but we need to be mindful of the kinds of partnerships that we pursue.
Another thing I want to talk about, it's not directly related to funding, but another thing with the three-tier system is that the UCs are the research entity of the educational system. And one thing that we did find throughout our research and our interview is that, like Jack said earlier, the students are really interested in research. It is a huge part of our campus. And as much as a lot of professors believe that students would like the professor to focus on them more, there are still a lot of students realizing the kind of good that the research has brought to the society, and also the amount of knowledge that students can learn from the research by the professors. So I think that having the UC system being designated as the research unit for the educational system is important, and it was a good structure.
So following up on my earlier, can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah, you have to hold it. Oh, following on my earlier question, obviously you spent a lot of time reading this wonderful literature, and I was wondering if prior to doing your survey, you had some general hypotheses that you were going to test, because these questions seem to be fairly structured for the larger instrument. And did you, as a group, discuss this? And if you did, were you surprised or not surprised? So I guess the question is two-part. Did you have some general guiding hypotheses that you were trying to examine through your survey instrument? And two, were you surprised? Were they supported or not supported? Or were you surprised by the results from the survey?
Well, I can say that initially, without reading all the research, literature, I was feeling that I was forming a hypothesis, but I had to keep in mind when we came to really draw up our study that we shouldn't have too much of a hypothesis, because we want the student's hypothesis, and that's kind of the goal of the research, is to find their direct perception. And so a lot of our challenges were trying to come up with questions that actually might indicate their perception, which is actually trickier to do than we thought it was. So it might seem unimpressive when we give our results, because a lot of the question, like a duh answer to our study is a good answer, because it kind of means that everyone's aware of that perception. We would be very scared if we had wow, that's a very interesting perception that we've never heard before, because we're just kind of sifting through the majority of students' perceptions. That being said, I did have a hypothesis that students would have a very ignorant perspective about the goals of research, and I felt that I initially felt that education was becoming too much of a commodity in the marketplace, and that there was a large financial interest in this conversation, and that kind of interest probably wouldn't have been as present in an older form of the university. That might have been very exclusive, say in Newman's time or in even older institutions. It was a very elite institution, and the idea of like being sort of financially stable so that finances aren't a question, so you have the freedom to engage your intellectualism to the fullest potential. So I felt that a lot of our students do have the financial concern, and therefore will be, affected by that in their pursuit of knowledge. And I definitely think that's true. I think that has been proven true, that people are looking forward to their careers. They're not just looking forward to knowledge. But I also am impressed with how articulated people's opinions and perceptions are when you really have a chance to do student-to-student interaction and focus group one-on-one and things of that nature.
I think we also had several informal hypotheses as well, just based on our own experiences as undergraduates. For example, I recall when reading much of the literature that a lot of the philosophers saw undergraduate education as like seeking truth and beauty and sweetness and light, to be exact. But nowadays, I remember thinking to myself, well, this isn't really why I'm going to college and why the people I know are going to college. And even when we asked, what's your primary reason for going to college? I can't remember, but I think 80 to 90% of our respondents said that they mainly went to college for career opportunities, which is in great contrast to what we found when we were examining the literature.
I would just like to add that as students, we do speak with other students, and we have an idea of the kinds of things that are floating around as far as the opinions on these various issues that we looked at. And when it came to the question of whether or not the university was in a crisis, which was sort of one of the things we thought we might be examining at the very beginning, we found that crisis is a very strong word, and although I think we all remember when the Occupy movement came to Davis, I think that was an event that brought a lot of attention to some of these issues, and I think it's good that we were able to try to sift through the literature, make sure that we were accurately forming our questions so that we could appropriately inquire about these various issues.
I just wanted to add one more thing. One of the things that we had discussed as a group and we thought would definitely be a theme, and it proved to be a theme throughout the qualitative elements of our research, was accessibility, which was a huge portion of the master plan, or very important to students. And I was really shocked. I mean, I thought we were going to get dozens of answers saying free tuition, but I was really shocked at how pragmatic students were when we asked them the question, what's your ideal version of the university? I mean, and this is in a utopian world, what would the university be? And they said, more scholarships, more grants, better funding from the government, not just free tuition. So, I mean, students, they're thinking critically and comprehensively about these subjects, and I think that was one of the most surprising things about the results for me.
Sorry for the long answers, but I suppose for me, I view the answers to your questions as three parts. First part would be the literature, which is in a way is historical. Therefore, a lot of the ideals, a lot of the ideas and thoughts are discussed in the literature will obviously be a little different than our experiences today. And the second part is personal. As a UC Davis student, same with all my fellow researchers, we do have a certain kind of hypothesis in mind, but it really depends on the kind of question we're answering, since we have so many different areas and aspects. And thirdly is the students' responses. Like I said, we somewhat had an inkling of how the answers would look like, but when we actually get the students' responses, there are a few things I was surprised. For example, like Megan said, the financial part. In the interviews especially, I was surprised to see how some of the answers that students come up. For example, one economics student did state that perhaps raising the taxes on property, it would really fund the education. Another example is some students did say maybe in some way the research done by the professors can help fund the university as well. But those are just individual perspectives. And again, in terms of research, I was also surprised simply because I would believe that students would like the professors to focus on teaching more, but the students really do still like the research part of the faculty. And thirdly is the class sizes that I never really thought about. But for me, what was not far away from what I expected was an online component which I believe online components are just simply cannot compare to a physical campus.
I guess you sort of got to this a little bit in the last part of your answer, but I was interested in this discussion of research versus instruction, and I think many of us as faculty members believe very deeply that research and teaching both help one another. But it's incredibly hard, I think, to articulate that to an outsider. And I wondered if any of the students, I wonder if you heard any expression of that, or if students see those connections as mutually reinforcing, and what they had to say about it.
I'd like to share something related to that. Is this working? Yeah, okay. Well, we use the term in our survey and in our presentation, instruction and education, quite interchangeably. Cardinal John Henry Newman, when we were reading his literature, makes a very clear distinction. And so do some other philosophers of foreign traditions of education to us. Instruction is something that you can teach a skill, something you could learn at the JC, at the Cal State, something you could learn in an apprentice workshop, something, very, very skill-oriented. And education in Cardinal John Henry Newman's mind was a type of instruction, but not quite, more of an environment that facilitates learning, that really factors in the unique environment of the university, where truth is kind of being batted around by these faculty, is being absorbed by the students and, iterated, and therefore informing the philosophical habits of the student and the ethics and even to some extent, because he was acknowledging a religious component of education, the spiritual qualities of the individual and morality. So I think a lot of that particular definition of education, is lost in our modern the student perception, because I felt that the term instruction and education were used so interchangeably by so many students, and even by our own research team. It was hard to make a distinction. So that being said, I just wanted to make that comment before we address education and instruction.
So I believe your question was asking whether the students that we talked to have commented on the research versus teaching. And I do have a couple examples that I want to bring up. Is one student did say that by being in a class that were taught by researchers that were excited about their projects, he was motivated to actually want to look into higher education and research, or perhaps doing research in the future, whereas he was not thinking about it before going to the class. So I think that's one impact that faculties doing research really has on students. Personally, I'm the same way. I did not ever think I would want to do research or be a professor, but seeing professors doing research, having learned from them, it really has an impact on my career choice. And also, although a lot of the students had talked about research or science students, there are also students who are not. For example, one was a design major, and to her, the research was really taking a personal project, looking for the problem. For example, the UC Davis focused a lot on diversity, on sustainability, and that's what her research project was based on. And to her, this was important simply because a lot of times the class structure may be structured in the way that it's quite limited to personal freedom exploration. But having that research, having this outlet really allows her to find what she wants to do and really construct a kind of learning that she wants to have.
I think in some respects, perhaps the way that we worded the question on the survey may have been imposing a false dichotomy between education and research, because around 15% of the students wrote in that you really can't separate the two, that research is a part of the education, and so they should be equal priorities of the faculty. So I guess in that sense, that would have been a little bit of a flaw of our survey, and perhaps in the future we could leave that as a third option, both research and instruction equal.
So I think you probably, this is a good follow-up to your observation. So what's quite unusual is you did a mixed method approach. Oftentimes, even PhD students will focus on a qualitative method or a quantitative method, and partly because of the complexity of really understanding the nuances. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what do you think informed you more about the perspective of the students? Do you feel that the interviews that were longer narratives, do you feel that the focus groups, do you feel that the surveys, in your mind, what really helped you fully understand from the methods that you used the narrative of the student experience here? And I say narrative, recognizing that the method could be very different that helps explore that narrative.
Well, we knew that we wouldn't be able to reach pretty much every single undergraduate and represent them in our interviews and focus groups, because that would just be pretty much impossible with the time constraints that we had. So we sent out the survey to as many undergraduates as we could access, because we wanted to obtain pretty much a frequency of student opinions. And we felt that the interviews and focus groups would explain the reasoning behind those opinions.
Yeah, Susan Susan worded it pretty well. Again, with the survey, we were fairly limited with what we could ask the students, but it was interesting in that we got to see what students broadly were saying to some of these questions. But then we reviewed some of these questions in the interview and focus groups, and some of the responses that we got really added a lot of color to the answers that were just sort of, more or less yes or no on some of the survey questions. So I feel that the qualitative research was a little bit more fun, maybe, because there was a great dialogue that we got to share with various students that we got to meet and hear different stories. And I wish that we had more time to share what everyone said, because everyone really had some deep insights. But again, what people were saying in the survey and focus groups were backing a lot of what we had found in the survey. So I think they, as far as the research design, they tied in well together.
Audience? I think we'll move now to audience questions, and we'll jump back in if there's a lull, but there's microphones here, so please.
I'm wondering, one of the previous forums we had students say that they are forced to quit, discontinue from the program because they can't afford it anymore. So I wonder whether you have asked in the questions you circulated, there was anything about the increase in tuition and that has happened in comparison to the increase in the number and cost of administration, for example, on the campus.
Unfortunately, we did not really address that problem in our research design. However, I think when we ask students what their ideal public university is, and the fact that so many of them brought up funding, perhaps we can predict that maybe that's why students dropped out. I know when at the very, very beginning of our project, we're looking at different populations to look at: UC Davis undergraduates, alumni, graduate students, high school students, students from other UCs, before we really narrowed it down to Davis undergraduates. And I think at one point we even discussed talking to students who had dropped out of UC Davis because they couldn't continue anymore to figure out why.
Yeah, because it's very important when we talk about the role of the public university, what the public means, which means if you work as an administrator, you are a public servant, right? Not a CEO of a corporation. So there is a big difference in if you are a leader of the public universities compared to if you're running the company Apple. So if the students can't afford to go to school, then if we are spending a lot of the taxpayer money in supporting an infrastructure of administrators, then there is something wrong.
I hope I can address your question fully. I apologize if I cannot. One thing I want to bring out is during our research, when we talked directly to the students, a lot of students did bring up that the financial problem that the cutting of budget at public university can be considered a crisis, and of a lot of problems that are happening to the educational system, this is probably the biggest of them. And another thing, I don't understand, I hope I understand you correctly, but I think that most of the students that we talk to, while they believe that the public educational system should be accessible for all, but there's a condition to accessible for all. For students who are qualified for this type of education, not to say that people do not deserve this education, but they see it more as an equal opportunity that anybody should have this opportunity to get to this education. But since the resources are limited, unfortunately, not everyone can have it.
I think at least what I thought you were trying to get at was like saying there's like a corporatist mentality in running the UC system. Was that it? Yeah. Okay, so what I think about that is a lot of that really began circa master plan with Clark Carr. And I think also when you look at the fact that we have had so much public funding cut from the universities, I mean, we sort of have to get a little more creative in running them. I mean, I think we need to change our definition of public really now, because so little of the public interest is now in the university. It's really in different hands, and it has to be run differently. And this is a conversation that I'm a political science major, so I'm a little biased in this, but I really think this is a conversation that needs to happen in government, and the people need to take it to their legislators in Sacramento.
We have a government of the people, right? And so we can't just blame it on the government. It's the people who have to feel they're getting their money's worth when they send their kids to the school, then they will be willing to put the money necessary to get that education.
Maybe we should take another question, give someone else a chance here. Go ahead.
I've got the mic here. Jack T. mentioned the Occupy movement, and which was obviously part of the genesis of this series and the backdrop. And so I guess I'm curious your sense of how much that movement is reflected in what you found in this survey. Does it have any lasting impact on how students are thinking about this, or is this just something from the past that's done and gone now completely and not reflected here?
I would say that the Occupy movement occurred, that's quite some feedback. The Occupy movement occurred during my freshman year, and I remember I stayed out for one night on the quad, and it was very cold, and I froze a little bit, and then I went home, and that was it. And at the time, I think it became winter, the Occupy movement sort of slowed down, and then eventually left the campus, and in the years since that, I don't think any of us have really forgotten, and I think perhaps that's why so many students at Davis right now have some articulated views on some of the issues that we were examining. So I do think that the Occupy movement was at least successful in getting people thinking about these issues, both on and off campus.
Question?
Yeah.
Provost?
Yeah. Thank you. I have to say that, and I had the benefit of seeing a preview of this. One of the things that I found most interesting and telling to us were students' views on the community colleges. And you talked, I believe, to a number of transfers here. And of course, part of the master plan and its brilliance was to make sure there was a good pathway of transfer from the community colleges. But what we heard through you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that many of those students found that in one sense, and do correct me on this, their experience in the classes that they had were somehow more accessible. There was a degree of comfort there, which I have to say somewhat surprises me, at least as a member of the UC. So I wonder if there are things we could learn from what you heard in that regard.
So Jack and I both worked on the focus group quite heavily, so we probably have the same response. The focus group was a good chance for us to have a good sampling of transfer students and non-transfer students side by side, so we could really have them batting back the ideas and see what resonated independent of what we had indicated on our survey. It seemed that there was like a sort of split opinion dependent on which community colleges that each person went to. Some community colleges are more heavily funded than others. The one at my own home shut down during summer, several summers in a row. So I never had an opportunity to go to it, and I was very upset about that. But I was encountering student opinions that felt their community college in the Bay Area was very heavily funded. There was more money, more dollars devoted to the student in the classroom that the community college system received. I think there's probably an element of competition. The instructors are there to fully instruct, and therefore that is their emphasis, and students are there to learn, and that's their goal. So there's a real sort of camaraderie in the classroom that occurs, and that's really what students are interested in. But it is interesting to note that it's interesting to note that people still felt there was another desired kind of interaction that needs to happen at the university, one of greater opportunity and greater interest in things beyond the instruction. And I think the topic of funding relates most heavily to the benefits of going to the community college. But the other topics of what are the characteristics of the university seem to point more towards the UC and still draws people here, and they're willing to go into debt after graduation for that. I do think it's the issue of accessibility by merit is not fully addressed by this current system based off my impression, because students who are very successful, very interested in the UC experience will benefit educationally from the CCC, but then not benefit from the other things on campus based on their financial standing. And they will come in as transfers and hopefully get plugged in appropriately within 2 years' time. But many students do not. So we didn't have many students that weren't connected, because it seems like we kind of had a selection bias when we were getting peer recruitment or something like that. So.
I just wanted to add, as a transfer student, that really resonated with me. The students in our focus group who were transfers mentioned that they felt the lower division coursework, which they completed at their community colleges, was, I don't want to say a better quality, but was more accessible to them, and they felt like they got more out of it than if they were to take those lower division courses here at UC Davis. And what we found, sort of as a theme also through our survey, was that a lot of that had to do with just the sheer size of lower division classes, especially when you look at those science classes, the chemistries, the biologies. Those classes, the size seems to really impact the student's education. And I can attest that in community colleges, you're looking at 30 kids often, and it is a more conducive learning environment. So as far as what the UCs can do, I'm not really sure. It's a really difficult problem to address. But I think we see a lot of that happening, sort of the changing dynamics between CCCs, the CSUs, and the UCs, and just, I think, more evolution needs to happen, and it will help address that.
Just quick, one last thing I want to add is that a lot of times students, if financially capable, would still choose coming to UCs for the most part, simply because the continuity in terms of culture, in terms of getting acquainted with the campus, and also because the diversity that the classes are offered in the lower division, even though maybe the classes are really huge, the topics and the majors that are available at a UC campus is better for someone who wants to explore different interests. And upper division, of course, it's very valuable at the UC campus, and for most of the students that we talk to, they believe that this is what they came, well, especially what they came to UC for the upper division courses.
Question.
I have California is a huge state. California is really a country. We all know that. And here we are in this incredible system. And my question, or more, I guess, of a comment, is that I'm just wondering how consistent the data that you find would be across other campuses. Did you ever have conversations with other campuses, or maybe some students that you know from other campuses?
Actually, yeah, while designing this project, I actually sent rough drafts of our survey to some of my friends at other UC systems because I was curious in what they would say. In particular, I have a friend from Berkeley who, as an economics major, didn't really seem to think that research was that important, although we kind of found the exact opposite with Davis students, so maybe he was an anomaly in that.
I'm just curious, who else you felt, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. You wanted,
I totally forgot what I was going to say.
I was just curious, who else you felt might have been underrepresented in the work, as you mentioned the transfer, or the not plugged in transfer students, but others that might have been missed?
Well, I think that one thing that any sort of majoritarian survey will miss is the fact that we have a lot of majors on campus and departments that really shine internationally. For entomology, we have all sorts of food science. I'm food science. We have all sorts of related disciplines that are, have programs that rank #1 or close to #1 in the world. And what we end up finding is a lot of engineers and people who respond to these surveys, or in the focus group, we had a large sample of engineers. We really need more focus groups to get any sort of representative opinion. General ideas, I think, are fine to sample from that, but there is a distinct difference in each department with their curriculum and how people interact with their education and their material. So engineers tended to sort of see the benefits of all kinds of education. Some people like to say that engineers have a chip on their shoulder, that they can be Renaissance men. And I don't know if that's true, but I definitely found there was a very well-rounded opinion from our engineers. But there also was an awareness that for the first 2 years of their study, they really needed to be devoted to getting their core classes out of the way. And they can't really fiddle around with other side classes. So being in a community college system is somewhat attractive to them, because just getting that core material out of the way and then gives you the freedom to come to the UC, not go into too much debt, and still benefit from all the wonderful environment. So we didn't get a great sample of humanities students, or even other fields of science where maybe, like for my own experience in biology class, we have a vet school. So when you're doing and we're gonna have a global disease biology major coming up. So the interaction between the genetics and the cellular, development of the education around cellular development and viruses and virology and all that is interacting with our vet school and our intellectuals there, as well as in agriculture, as well as other fields. So this linking of fields also feeds down to even the lower division biology courses, where every course the professor will say, last year we said something different here because we hadn't come out with this paper. And I think that kind of perspective was somewhat neglected by the sample we had. But it also brought up the point of, calculus, physics, these things don't change very much. So why do we have to pay through the nose for this intellectual material when many other colleges, even community college, do a better job getting it to us?
Additionally, I think another population of interest would be the people who didn't answer our survey, however, much of a paradox that sounds. For our survey results, so many people responded to our open-ended question at the end in so much detail. So these people were really invested in their responses to the survey. I would love to look at the students who saw our survey in their email inbox and said, this isn't important to me, I don't want to answer it, because I think their opinions on these topics could really differ from the responses that we actually got.
Yes, like Susan said, during our research, especially for the qualitative part, we were a little bit afraid of the selection bias where the students who decided to respond are the students that may think a certain way. So how we can go about adjusting this, not quite sure. But originally we did anticipate more social sciences and political science students to respond, but it ends up to be the opposite of what we expected. But really, it's really just time constrained, because originally we ideally would like to talk to the different political clubs on campus, people of different ethnicity, different affiliation. But in the end, it really just, in terms of time and resources, it was not possible.
So I want to put a punctuation mark to this part of our discussion. We have a reception, and I hope everyone will stay and talk to our students and other panelists. I have to say, going off script, that I am so proud of the students. I will also say that this vision I had, that the Davis Honors Challenge would be a great way to get student opinion, that, in my opinion, has proved absolutely true. And I'm also pleased that, as I anticipated, Vice Chancellor De La Torre and Professor Stevens were the perfect interlocutors for this session. So thank you to one and all, and please do stay for our reception, and thank you very much.